Davis, who talks about his decision to switch to the Republican Party. We'll also hear from Republican Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio and Tea Party Patriot co-founder and CEO Jenny Beth Martin. This is about an hour.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I hear we're out of food. Sorry. I guess it pays to show up early, right? There's a Subway next door. Our armbands, right? Todd won't like that. Thanks, everybody, for joining us at the Bloggers Briefing. If it's your first time coming to Heritage, welcome. We welcome our viewers on C-SPAN and on Breitbart TV. Thank you for tuning in today. For those of you who are new, basically we'll have three speakers. We're going to give them an opportunity to make some remarks, and then we'll have them take your questions. And we're very excited to have all three of them join us today. We're going to begin with Artur Davis. He's a former member of Congress from Alabama. He represented the 7th Congressional District in Alabama for 8 years as a Democrat. He held leadership positions within the party and was one of the first members of Congress to endorse Barack Obama in 2008. Today, he has a different perspective on things as a result of some of the policies that were pursued in the aftermath of Obama's election, and he's going to share his thoughts on those issues as well as other things that may be on your mind. So please join me in welcoming Artur Davis.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. Rob, after the introduction, some of you are probably wondering why the heck I'm here. I'll say a little bit more about that. Let me just begin by thanking all of you for coming out today, the folks who are listening in from online or other places. Let me thank them for joining us as well. I was telling Rob that I did get the memo that you guys prefer the comments to be on the short side. Only problem is, as someone who used to be an elected official, short may not mean to me what it does to you. Perhaps to you it means I've talked too long already. For me it means I have about 6 minutes to go. So we'll try to create a happy medium around that. Let me start out by first of all saying one thing about where we are now, Heritage. I turned 45 years old this year, which, by the way, I'm thankful to the gray hairs in the room for making me not the only old person who's here today. I know people looking at this cannot tell, but there are a lot of incredibly young people sitting in this room right now, so I'm thankful to the gray hairs. But I turned 45 years old in October. So when I got interested in politics in the early 1980s, President Reagan had just come to power. Heritage was kind of the only game in town when it came to smart, creative policy ideas. And a lot of the things that President Reagan did during the 1980s, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the template for change, a lot of it obviously came out of the imagination of Ronald Reagan. I'll say something about that toward the end of my comments. But a lot of the rest of it came in these hallways and from people who have been associated with this foundation for a very long time. So as someone who's kind of a new convert to the Republican Party, but not such a new convert to conservatism, this is kind of like being in the cathedral. So I'm honored in that sense. Rob alluded to the fact that I switched parties a few weeks ago and did it the new-fashioned way. I did a listing on my blog about it. And I've gotten some attention, some publicity for it, most of it not deserved. Yes, it is a little bit unusual for someone who used to be a Democratic elected official to switch parties. Yes, it is unusual, frankly, for an African-American Democratic elected official to switch political camps. I kind of get all of that. But I want to put this in some perspective. 2008, President Obama got 53% of the vote, which, by the way, is the biggest margin anybody running for president of the United States has gotten since 1988, when President George H.W. Bush got 54%. Relative landslide in our closely polarized country, right? President Obama's approval rating today Depending on the poll you look at, 46, 47%. Depending on the poll you look at, he and Governor Romney have been pretty much tied with each other at 45 or 46 for most of the last several weeks. So Artur Davis is not the only person who was in the Obama camp in 2008 who has been in political migration. By my Harvard math, which is probably badly flawed, 10 million Americans or so have shifted camps. And I brought these notes with me because I want to share with you for a few moments some things that people have written me in the course of the last several months. All of these quotes are from people who either identify themselves as Democrats or people who say that they voted for Barack Obama and don't identify their party. I want to read you this because it provides some clarity for why I am literally a pebble in an ocean of change. One lady wrote me, quote, "I figured out in the middle of the worst economy in my life how to start a business and make money. And I just paid 1/3 of what I earned, not to my kids' college savings or to my retirement, but to the federal government. And I'm tired of being told I didn't pay my fair share." Another guy wrote me, again, this is a person who identified himself as an Obama supporter 4 years ago. He said that his employer has just sent out a notice that it's shifting to a higher deductible health care plan that provides stingier benefits than the ones that exist today. This gentleman wrote to me, quote, "They told me their reforms wouldn't change my insurance. Why did they lie to me?" That's his quote. Another guy said that he volunteered in the Obama campaign. Here's what he wrote me. Quote, "I'm tired of being told that if I want the worst teachers out of my kids' school and want state employees to pay for their retirement the same way I do, that it means I hate teachers and despise public service." Finally, another gentleman said, quote, "I voted for Obama because he said business as usual was over in Washington. Promise broken." Now, a lot of our friends on the left wouldn't find any of that terribly poetic. There's nothing about this being the moment when the rise of the oceans will begin to cease. It's no poetic declaration that we're the ones we've been waiting for. But the comments that I've just read to you, there's a very powerful kind of eloquence to them, ladies and gentlemen, because they're the way people talk around the dinner table. They're the way ordinary people talk to themselves about politics, and they are making a case, and people like them who don't have a forum, who may not even have access to a computer to write a guy like me, people all around this country, regardless of the level of their voice, a lot of them are saying, we have changed our political fates because the people we used to listen to either didn't tell us the truth or they got it flatly wrong. So I want to start by saying to my friends on the right, and that's not everybody here, but it's a lot of you, we don't really have to heckle the other side. We don't really have to shout down the other side. We don't have to cut the president off his press conferences, because the more the other side keeps talking, the more the other side keeps making its arguments, the more people are beginning to move our way. I firmly believe that. And they may be moving our way not on the wings of remarkable poetry, but on the wings of their common sense. That's point number one. Now, point number two, I want to confess a deep envy I've always had toward conservatives for a very simple reason. Well, part of it's the fact that you guys won all the elections in Alabama and my old side didn't. But there's always another thing I've always kind of envied about people on the political right. This is a center-right country. 40% of Americans call themselves conservatives, roughly 20% call themselves liberals. So at any given time, those of you on the center right, you get to spend a lot of your time arguing to people why their instincts and inclinations are right and why they ought to vote based on their beliefs. My old side, it used to always kill me. We had to spend a lot of our time telling people the things you think are not right. You do not really think them. They may be important to you, but they're not important in the scheme of things, so you ought to vote for what we think is important. And it was amazing how that worked out for my old side. You know, in fact, if you kind of look back at the history of elections, again, there are all these young people in the room in your 20s, so I know ancient politics to you is Bush versus Gore. But when you think about, Republicans have gotten to win a lot of elections, 72, 84, 88, and 2004, Republicans, conservatives more or less won by telling people that the status quo was working and that they ought to give the status quo a chance to continue, and by saying the other side was too extreme. Arguably, one time conservatives won in 2000 when the other side was in power by saying the status quo was working, and we're going to give you a more ethical version of it. You guys have gotten to win a lot of elections, frankly, by talking about the status quo. But what always fascinated me as a sympathetic observer, for all the elections you won talking about the status quo, I've always had a sense the election that you cared most about could not have been more different from that kind of appeal. I'm talking about 1980. 1980, Ronald Reagan came to the country. And he didn't have the luxury of saying, what we're doing is working, let's continue it. Because what we were doing had wrecked the economy. What we were doing had caused the U.S. to lose its first war. What we were doing had caused the United States to fall second to the Soviet Union. And for the only time since World War II in the early 80s were the only time since World War II where our side of the value scale in terms of global politics, our side was on the wane, the other side was on the ascension. So Ronald Reagan could not come to the country and say that what we're doing is working. He also couldn't speak to a Republican country because 52% of Americans call themselves Democrats as late as the late 1970s, and the number of Republicans is roughly in the upper 30s. So instead of making an appeal to keep things the way they are and not take a chance on risk, the election that so many conservatives care the most about, the one I think you trade all the others for in some ways, is 1980, when Ronald Reagan had to come to this country and say, we appear to be in the doldrums, we appear to be losing our way, we can do better if we recover what has always been best in our tradition. And ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who do not remember that time, it was a very powerful clarion call that touched people working on shipyards in Gdansk, people living under the shadow of political tyranny from Cuba to China, touched blacks in South Africa, touched people all over the world who loved hearing the clarion call of freedom. For all the people in your 20s who were here, people in their 20s in the 1980s were almost genetically predisposed to be Democrats. All their teachers told them that was the way to go. All their college professors told them that. All of a sudden they fell in political love with a guy who was 70 years of age, who was not a part of their culture, who was not a part of their lifestyle, but who spoke powerfully to their sense of imagination. Blue-collar Americans, people who work with their hands, who had been taught, understandably in some cases, that the Republican Party of their day was the party of economic royalism and didn't sympathize with their aspirations. All of a sudden they discovered that there was a party that connected with their faith and their goals for their lives economically, and that it was the Republican Party. And all of a sudden blue-collar people who worked with their hands found a home in a conservative party. Now, I mention all that before I take your questions for a very simple reason. I have a hunch that this may be 1980 all over again. The challenges we are facing. All of a sudden, our leaders act as if we're weak. What do our leaders tell us over and over? We were elected to govern, we were elected to lead, but we've got to check in and make sure that Athens and Madrid are sailing properly. We've never heard that before. We've never heard leadership in this country say that our fortunes depend on Athens and Madrid. This could very well be a time, ladies and gentlemen, 20 years from now, when some of the young people around this table are standing up here, hopefully as senators and not former congressmen. But I think this will be a time we remember. So for those of you in the room who are part of the center right, I'm happy to be here with you. The first president I remember is Ronald Reagan. Yes, I do remember the preacher of my church telling everybody to vote for Jimmy Carter, but that's another story. The first presidency I remember is Ronald Reagan's. I remember how he turned the country around. And if you're in the camp of people who thinks we need turning around right now, by the way, that doesn't mean that Mitt Romney has to be Ronald Reagan. There has been one. There won't be another one. But it means one very simple thing. Boldness matters in politics. Boldness is rewarded in politics. Clarity is rewarded in politics. Governor Walker can tell you that in Wisconsin. Governor Christie can tell you that in New Jersey. Clarity is rewarded in politics. And the last thing Governor Romney needs is advice from a new guy. But the last thing out of my mouth before I take some questions is this. I think the American people are ready to hear a clarion call. I think they're ready to hear the man who would lead us tell us that we can control our own destiny. Not Madrid, not Athens, we can control our own destiny. And I think people are ready to have sense talk to them again. So that's my little spiel at the outset. With that said, I'm going to take some questions and be mindful of the time. And we're going to start with this gentleman. And everyone who speaks, just introduce yourself so I know who you are.
All right, so Congressman Matthew Boyle from the Daily Caller. I wanted to see, there's been a lot of criticism of Attorney General Holder over the past year or so. A lot of people are calling for him to resign, and I know that you were one of the ones, as a Democrat, that was one of the ones with Congressman Adam Schiff against leading a charge against Attorney General Gonzalez. Do you still have confidence in Attorney General Holder with everything Fast and Furious, Intel leaks, everything that's going on with the Justice Department now?
Well, let me say two things about the Attorney General. I'm going to try to not personalize the comments about the Attorney General. So I'll tell you a mistake that my old side made 5 years ago. You alluded to the controversy over the U.S. attorneys 5 years ago when I and some other people raised questions about the firing of those folks. I think my old side made a mistake. I'll tell you the mistake we made. We kind of personalized it a little bit, and we made a lot of it about Attorney General Gonzalez. And frankly, sometimes we seemed so mad at Attorney General Gonzalez that people stopped hearing what we were saying about how U.S. attorneys were selected and dismissed. I think we made a mistake in doing that. So I'm not going to bend over backwards to the other side and make the same mistake. But I want to say two things about the Department of Justice that kind of catch my eye. The first one, you know, Fast and Furious is something I have a very hard time understanding because I was a junior federal prosecutor in Montgomery, Alabama. I was 28 years of age, and I tried cases. I did a lot of drug and gun cases. And, you know, I never got to work in the high confines of the Department of Justice. That was kind of above my level. But we always had a basic principle. We did a lot of undercover operations. We always had a basic principle. Don't let guns and drugs walk. Okay. For those of you who don't watch cop shows in the room, when you do an undercover operation, yeah, do your deal, but don't let the bad guys leave with guns or leave with drugs. I had to understand that when I was 29 years of old trying cases in Montgomery, Alabama, and I probably would have gotten fired as an assistant U.S. attorney if I'd gotten that wrong, as people might have gotten killed because of my carelessness. So I have a very hard time understanding how if I had to get all that right as a 29-year-old, why people who are much more experienced in the Department of Justice seem a little bit confused about all of it. So I don't understand how this even came to be. And yeah, I think the Republicans on the Hill are absolutely right to try to get to the bottom of it. And second thing that bothers me, again, this is, I have no idea how you guys will relate to this. You may agree or disagree. But I have no idea why we just spent millions of dollars trying to figure out if Roger Clemens ought to be in the Hall of Fame. Now, I happen to be a convicted Atlanta Braves baseball fan. And I apologize for those who bother by that. But I love baseball, and as a fan of baseball, I care a lot about whether Roger Clemens cheated. I do not understand why when 10 baseball players went before Congress and claimed they didn't use steroids, why one of them ends up getting prosecuted for false statements, when frankly it looks like all of them probably didn't tell the truth. The John Edwards case, I know opinions may be mixed on that, but I saw that as a dispute over campaign finance law. So I don't get some of the priorities. In terms of, people who may be wondering, do I think Attorney General Holder ought to stay? Look, these guys and ladies serve at the pleasure of the president. President gets to keep them. If the president decides that he wants to keep this person around despite questions, that's his prerogative, and voters can make their own judgment based on that. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you for coming today and for your remarks. You've made a lot of courageous remarks regarding the accusation that a lot of the states are trying to disenfranchise voters by putting in place voter ID requirements or purging the rolls of people that have passed away years ago. Can you talk a little bit about that in detail?
Yeah, I'm sure. Let me put this in perspective. This is the only building I've been in Washington that didn't ask me for an ID. And I may be outing the Heritage Foundation by doing that, but Rob, seriously, this is the only building I have been in where I have not been asked to present photo ID. So I guess I feel safe standing here. But most of you know this from your own experiences. If you go to virtually any building in Washington, D.C., you get asked for your ID. The Department of Justice that is in court right now telling 3 states that they cannot pass voter ID laws, that same Department of Justice, you can't get much past the guard gate without showing somebody, or the little stile you walk into when you get there, you can't get much past that without showing somebody an ID. It's required. I did an interview with a TV or radio station a few months ago, and the reporter, was, different side of the political persuasion from a lot of folks in this room. The reporter was really pressing me about voter ID. And the reporter was saying, isn't this simply a Trojan horse to discriminate? And I had to remind the reporter to get in her building, there was a big giant sign saying photo ID required, no exceptions. And I had to tell her if I had actually left my driver's license at home and go back and get it at first. If I had not turned around and gotten my license, I couldn't have gotten in to do the interviews. I wouldn't have had a photo ID. So I'm for photo ID for a very simple reason. I think it's just good common sense. Our financial life, our lives as people who work and go into buildings, our lives as people who have to get on planes. We're accustomed to presenting ID. I don't think it bothers anybody. I don't think it disfranchises anybody. And I think it's just common sense. Back to the room.
Michael New, professor, University of Alabama.
Michael, thank you.
Great to see you, Congressman. Question for you is this. Do you think there's anything the Democratic Party can do in Alabama and other southern states to remain viable in statewide elections?
Well, I know they can't keep doing what they're doing right now. Those of you in the room who are from the South, your parents and grandparents, whatever you were, I bet you they were Democrats. And that's kind of a cheap guess because everybody was kind of prior to 1970. Things changed. The South became 2-party, and now it's arguably become 1 party. But At one point, Democrats had enormous strength in the South, and that was irrespective, by the way, of how presidential elections were going. Richard Nixon was winning Alabama with 80% of the vote. George Wallace got reelected as a Democrat as governor with 70% 2 years later. Democrats had all but one seat in the legislature. Democrats and voters in the South had no problem, splitting their brain when it came to politics. They would think, I'm going to be a Republican when it comes to president, and increasingly I'm going to be a Republican when it comes to voting for Senate, but they voted for Democrats for all manner of other offices. Well, all of a sudden that started to change, and today you look at the party ID numbers in Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. I don't want to drag race into this, but this makes a point. Roughly 18% of white males identify themselves as Democrats right now in the states I just mentioned. You cannot win an election when less than 1 out of 5, or one of the biggest cohorts, identifies with your party. That's just not going to happen. Why has it happened? Without getting into particularities of any one state's politics, I think Democrats have tended to make 2 big mistakes. Here's the first one. A lot of Southern Democrats have a tendency to, remember I said at the beginning how Democrats spend a lot of time telling voters what you think is wrong? What you think is important is not so important. Politics is a customer, consumer-oriented business. The customer is always right. And if you're campaigning for office, if your job is saying, that issue you really care about, that's just a dumb issue. The thing that you think is important, you need to realize that that's not nearly as important as this thing we're trying to do in the state capitol right now. Voters don't respond very well to that kind of thing. Second and last point I will make is who were the kinds of Democrats who used to win in the South? They were conservative Democrats. There are virtually none left in the Democratic Party. And I'll make just this one point about it, as I know it's a big point of debate in Washington, D.C. How many of you have heard somebody, just by show of hands, how many of you have heard somebody say in the last few weeks, oh, those Republicans, they have gone off the far end, they are so extreme, they have no tolerance for opposing viewpoints? Show of hands if you heard somebody say that. Okay. That's kind of what people say in Washington, but here's what you ought to know. If you're in the Democratic Party, if you don't think the same on about 5 or 6 or 7 issues as the mainstream of your party, you are as much out to lunch as any moderate Republican would be, and many people can testify to that. That's not simply part of my story, it's part of the story of many Democrats. And people say to me, well, isn't it true, Davis, that 35% of Democrats call themselves moderates and 25% call themselves conservatives? That may very well be the case. Of course, it's true that 37% of Republicans call themselves moderates too, and nobody ever talks about that. But let's assume that's the case for a moment. There is a difference between people and the elected officials who are the voice for the party. Yeah, there are plenty of moderate Democrats and a few conservative Democrats left in the party in terms of people who ID and identify with the party, but when it comes to people who are elected officials, that number is perilously low. So I think that's the challenge Democrats have in the South, being an open, inclusive party. Okay.
Artur, I know that Congressman Jordan is
Yes,
here, so
yes.
Please stay with us.
I will be
And I
glad
want
to
to
do
thank
it.
you
I'll be
for
glad to
joining
do it.
us.
Thank you all for listening to me today. Thank you. Thank you.